As you know, Taylor begins the secular age with the question that around the year 1500, belief was natural and taken for granted, while unbelief was practically unthinkable, while in the year 2000, the condition is radically the inverse. It is unbelief that is natural and taken for granted, while it is belief that is the condition that demands some kind of search, reflection, some kind of affirmation. We know, of course, that this is, Charles generalizes across the North Atlantic. He is well aware that in the United States, the conditions of belief and unbelief are somewhat different. So I'm going to, if you wish, exaggerate the difference between Western Europe and the United States for the sake precisely of argument to open up the possibility or the rethinking of how the globalization of the same immanent frame, as you know, the kind of the interlock constitution of the cosmic order of nature through science and technology, the social order of the democratic state, the market economies, the mediatic public spheres, and the moral order of individual agents claiming the inalienable right to life, liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness, that the globalization of this immanent frame is accompanied by very different phenomenological experiences, both religious and secular. To put it most extremely, while in Europe it is natural for a teenager not to believe, and it takes a lot of courage for a teenager in Europe to go against the current and affirm a religious life attitude. It is the opposite in the United States. It is natural for a teenager to believe, and it takes a lot of courage for a teenager in the United States to go against the American current and to affirm unbelief or atheism. Again, this is the very, very stated in simple terms, precisely for the sake of argument. Now, this experience of secularization in Europe was perhaps most paradigmatically caught by the famous Catholic sociologist Gabriel Lebras, when he said, the moment a peasant from Bretagne sets foot in La Gare de Montparnasse, he ceases being a Catholic. It is this notion that setting foot at a modern urban center, persons cease being religious, which of course was understood in the traditional theory of modernization through the passage from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. And if you go to one of the classic formulations of the theory of secularization in the 60s by the British sociologist Brian Wilson, it's almost presented as syllogism. Religion is part of, or its natural habitat is the traditional Gemeinschaft. Gesellschaft dissolves all forms of community. Therefore, there is simply no room for religion in modern society. This is basically a logical argument. And of course, the empirical corroboration across Europe was overwhelming. The evidence was so clearly overwhelming, that it was natural to accept the explanatory theory as confirming and valid. We knew about the contrast American evidence, but it was understood as American exceptionalism, right? Either a laggard society which somehow not yet fully modern, not yet fully secular, but eventually will be. And you find even today secularists showing to you that in the last 2 decades, finally, the group of unbelievers in America has grown from 8% to 16%. And this is the fastest religious change in America, therefore evidence that finally American society is becoming secularized. Or the other explanation that religion in America has been so transformed by modern societies, by commodification, by democratization, by individualization, that it's not religion anymore. It should not count as evidence anymore, because this weird thing, which certainly is not recognizable as the traditional ecclesiastical European religion. Now, I'm not going to insist on the US European comparison. You could say Quebec is the European society across the border. It's a society in which in one single generation, the entire Catholic population of Quebec ceased being Catholic. And it is the most evident confirmation of the theory of modernization. Modernization leads to secularization. And this is the phenomenological experience lived by practically every Quebecois in Quebec. The same which has been lived by mass European societies. I'm going to later contrast two post-colonial, post-Catholic, New World societies, Quebec and Brazil, to point out the radically different ways in which the silent revolution of the 60s in Quebec and the silent revolution in Brazil had led to radically different conditions of, in the one case, homogeneous transition from Catholicism to secularity. In Brazil, the explosion of religious pluralism, from homogeneous Catholicism to all kinds of religiosities. And then I will contrast two very large, very important societies in the world today, India and China, and see how, again, the experience of modernization in both societies was experienced radically different and with very different conditions for the conditions of belief and unbelief in both societies. Now, if modernization does not explain the secularization of Europe, what explains it? And I don't have the opportunity to raise the issue or to develop the theory here, but I will link it to the combination of two concepts. Deconfessionalization. Secularization in Europe is first and foremost a process of deconfessionalization and the experience of a stadial consciousness, ceasing being Catholic or ceasing being Lutheran, ceasing being a confessional member of a church, is understood as a passage to a higher form of post-religion. So secularity is understood as a higher stage than a religious stage. It is this stadial consciousness and this deconfessionalization, which again is, I think, very similar to the Quebecois experience, which to a certain extent shapes or can best explain the secularizing consequences of this process in Europe. While in other societies in which such deconfessionalization does not take place because there was no prior process of confessionalization, then also modernization is not usually accompanied by the same kind of stadial consciousness of having left confessional identities behind. If Charles would have started the comparison, not the year 1500, but the year 1700, in my view, will have given us the key to this process, which I call deconfessionalization. Namely, from 1500 to 1700, European societies, through the establishment of the system of Westphalian territorial states, of absolutist confessional territorial states, led to the enforced confessionalization of the entire European population. Homogeneous Protestant in the north, homogeneously Catholic in the south, and the three biconfessional societies in between, Holland, Germany, and Switzerland. I still live in the 70s. When I was a student in Austria, I used to go to the Pfalz to work there during holidays, and I was living in a village that was 99% Catholic. There was only one Protestant man who had married a Catholic woman. The next village was 99% Protestant, and there was only a Catholic woman who had married a Protestant man. This had lasted in this biconfessional society of Germany for that long. Now, of course, the process of deconfessionalization has many different stages. I'm not going to get into it. There is the deconfessionalization of the state, there's the deconfessionalization of the nation, the deconfessionalization of individuals, but ultimately, it is the process of deconfessionalization of European societies in the 60s that, in my view, is the key to the secularizing results in Europe. In my own country, Spain, because Spain went through a forced process of reconfessionalization through the Franco regime. The process of deconfessionalization has also been extreme, and actually people went out of the church so badly that they forced the church to take their names out of the baptismal list, and when the church refused, they went to court and forced the church to do it, because they were forcefully, not voluntarily, have entered the Catholic confession. Now, where you don't have confessions, like in the United States, you have denominations. Denominations are not confessions. And usually, denomination you cannot translate in any European language. They cannot understand what a denomination is. They translate it as confession, which is the opposite of denomination. A denomination is a voluntary religious congregation. It's a name people give themselves, not mediated by the state. In the United States, the state doesn't even have the right, the government, to ask for the denominational identity of its citizens. So it's a process of recognition that takes place at the level of civil society. The point is, there was never a confessional church in the United States. Of course, there were confessional colonial churches, but even those, at most 20% of the population in Massachusetts, at most 20% of the population in Virginia, at most 20% of the population in New York belong to the colonial churches. The rest were unchurched. So the process actually of modernization in America is experienced not as a process of deconfessionalization, but as a process of Christianization. Deconfessionalization means liberation from enforced collective identities. So the process of individuation in Europe is understood as a process of liberation from religion. In America, the process of individuation, the process of democratization, the process of Christianization went hand in hand in parallel. I'm putting these arguments very simply, starkly. We could get into the details, but precisely to make the point, let me compare Quebec and Brazil. Again, Quebec was obviously a confessional society in a way in which other parts of Canada were not. The practically obligatory character of the Catholic national identity of Quebec. And we see how the process of modernization in Quebec, in terms of democratization, individuation, the Silent Revolution, is understood precisely as a passage from an enforced Catholic religious past to a modern national secular identity. Brazil had a colonial, hegemonic Catholic system, but it was not fully, it did not penetrate so fully the entire population. There were always submerged the Afro-Brazilian religions, the emerging Protestant religions, but since the 60s, where you find the explosion of transformation of religious pluralism in Brazil. Today, Brazil is not only, of course, the global center of Catholicism, global center which has a radically transformed Catholicism through the charismatic renewal of the Catholic Church, but the global center of Pentecostalism and the global center of Afro-American religions linking West Africa, the Caribbean, and Brazil. An explosion of all kinds of religious transformations. Again, while in Quebec, this silent modernization is experienced as precisely the construction of the conditions of unbelief, in Brazil is experienced as the explosion of what Charles called the nova and supernova effects of the multiplication of religious and secular, because there are processes of secularization going on in Brazil as well. Let me now move to, now that urbanization per se did not cause secularization. We knew from, if you compare the same peasants living villages from the Mezzogiorno, from southern Italy, going to Torino and Milano and ceasing being Catholic, going to Buenos Aires, a Catholic, post-colonial, ceasing being Catholic, becoming anarchists and socialists, going to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and actually becoming Catholics for the first time in North America, in Protestant North America. Today, we see evidence looking at global cities that all of them are teeming with new religious communities of all kinds. All the religions of humanity, from the most so-called primitive or pre-axial to all the axial religions to the most new, postmodern, new age forms of religion, are living together today and have to coexist in modern global cities. From New York to London, from Sao Paulo to Johannesburg, from Mumbai to Singapore. And so it is the new global condition forces us to rethink the story of modernization that we have received from the European experience. And it was a fundamental European phenomenological experience. But the experience in other parts of the world is different. Let me now contrast briefly. How much more time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. Contrast briefly India and China. Those were two non-Western societies confronting the threat, in one case real, already de facto, of Western colonialism. And how the modernizing elites, those who wanted to modernize their societies, use radically different strategies to basically protect themselves or to get rid of Western colonialism. In the case of India, the argument was, we need religion. Religion is the best resource we have, the one we can mobilize to precisely counter Western colonialism. And the result was what we know, the construction of modern Hinduism, the construction of a new form of collective religious identities in the process of modernization in the colonial encounter. And in India, modernization, post-colonial independence, democratization are precisely experienced phenomenologically along with a process of a new religious identity. In China, the modernizing elites decided that traditional Chinese religion, feudal religion, and all Chinese feudal cultures, traditional cultures, were the reason for the weakness of China, the inability of China to keep the Chinese wall from Western colonialism, and the need to get rid of every form of traditional religion. The slogan of every revolutionary movement, every modernizing movement in China from the 1911 revolution to the Cultural Revolution was smash temples, build schools. The opposition between traditional religion and modern knowledge, modern education, modern science was the fundamental premise of every process of Chinese modernization. Which, of course, in this respect, China is the society, non-Western society, that has almost adopted the European model of precisely the transformation to modernity as a passage from traditional religion to modern secularity. But a passage that clear in this case was one organized by elites from above through very violent methods. And we observe today, as China finally has caught up with the West and can beat the West at their own game, and as China is ready to overtake the United States as a global economic power, that all the traditional religions of China, that the elites have been trying for 100 years to destroy, are re-emerging again. And you have a religious explosion of, again, pluralism, religious pluralism in China in the last decade. We could go on in other parts of the world. The point I'm trying to make is that globalization forces us to rewrite not the narrative we have, because I think the narrative we have and the narrative that Charles has constructed, how the secular age came about, how the immanent frame was constructed, I think that it's, I fully agree with the narrative. I don't think that it can be rewritten. The point I'm trying to make is that once the immanent frame has been established, that the globalization of this immanent frame is experienced phenomenologically very differently and has very different consequences for the conditions of belief and unbelief. I just spent 3 weeks in Brazil. It was quite an experience, not only the opportunity to see the dynamism of Brazilian society today, but precisely in terms of the dynamics of religious pluralism. And let me simply, briefly, from a visit to the Facultad de Teologia Umbandista. Umbanda, as you know, is one of the two main Afro-Brazilian religions, Candomblé and Umbanda. So Umbanda has established its own faculty of theology, process of rationalization of this, and it has radically transformed its form of religion into a congregational, associational form of religion, has a journal which is called Teologia de Convergencia. And the whole argument is basically that in our global age, our principles of equality, liberty and, if you wish, pursuit of happiness demand that all the religions of humanity learn how to live together, all of them contributing whatever they have to contribute to the needs of global humanity today. And the argument is actually very much an argument taken, you could say, from the critique of instrumental reason of the Frankfurt School, that our monotheistic Judeo-Christian religions have a relationship to nature that has basically created the crucial ecological crisis in which we live, and that we need to go back to the old pre-axial religions and the kind of resacralization of nature, but also a different type of community to precisely confront the crisis. You may say all of this is simply adaptation to the global condition. It's not anymore, of course, traditional Umbanda. It's not anymore the Yoruba religion that came from Nigeria brought by the slaves, but it is a response to the global condition. And the argument I would like to make that we are in a situation, the secular age today, demands the kind of engaged pluralism in which the religions of the world and the religions and the secularities, if you wish, cannot be any more ranked hierarchically. There is not anymore any stadial consciousness. We may need a theory of stages of development to develop a genetic explanation of how we got where we are. But now we are in the age of globalization in which these hierarchies are flattened out spatially. It's not anymore a teleology of history where Europe shows the future to the rest of the world, but we are living, and the global city is the image precisely of this living together equally and not anymore hierarchically all the, you could say, religious and secular options of humanity, which demands a radical new form of conception of secularism, not as the stage after religion, if you wish, or the way of putting religion in its place to make sure that it does not create the problems which otherwise religion is going to bring, but precisely the kind of neutral condition of states that recognize religious pluralism as a fundamental thrust of global processes today. And of course, it's interesting how different, again, Europe, Western Europe and Quebec are confronting now, after they thought that they had already gotten rid of religion, are confronting the explosion of new religions as immigrant religions and the difficulty that our stadial consciousness has created for us to recognize these religions and to give them a place. Brazil has no difficulty precisely today in incorporating more and more religions, all of them, but also non-religion. So the issue is not, so I'm not arguing for the desecularization of the world, that religion is back. We're not entering a post-secular age, but it is a new type conception of secularity, which is understood not anymore as a stadial stage beyond past religion. It's not a post-secular condition. It's a new redefinition of secularity in a way that it has as a neutral space for religion, for all religions and for all forms of secularity. To a certain extent, you could say that this is the original theological meaning of saeculum in Augustine. When he presents the saeculum is the temporal space between now and the parousia, the second coming of Christ, in which Christians and pagans have to learn to live together in the saeculum, precisely, in the civil space. So it is one in which, of course, he could not but have a stadial consciousness of being post-pagan. Monotheism is based on this post, the Mosaic distinction of being a post-idolatrous, post-pagan religion. But it is this condition, and of course later you could say that Protestantism did the same to Catholicism, and then Enlightenment secularism did the same thing to religion. It is this post notion of stages of humanity, I think, that we are now challenged in our global condition and that we have to rethink.